Imagine a night in the heart of the Arabian desert, where the boundary between the world you know and the world you fear grows as thin as a spider's silk thread. The sand stretches endlessly in every direction, pale beneath a moon that offers no comfort, only the cold illumination of isolation. Here, in this vast emptiness where human civilization fades to memory, something waits. Something that has waited for millennia, patient as the stones, hungry as the void itself. This is the domain of the Ghul, and tonight, we cross into its territory. Welcome to Echoes of the Old World. If this is your first time joining us on this journey into the shadows of ancient folklore, I invite you to subscribe and become part of our community of those who seek the truth behind the myths that have shaped human fear and wonder across the ages. Ring that bell, because we delve into the darkness every week, unearthing the stories that refuse to die. Before we venture deeper into the desert night, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Are you safe in your home, surrounded by electric light and locked doors? Or are you, like me, drawn to these tales, precisely because they remind us that safety is an illusion we constructed, a fragile barrier against the primordial unknown that still breathes just beyond our perception? The Ghul is not a demon in the way Western tradition understands that word. It is not a fallen angel cast into perdition, nor is it a ghost tethered to the mortal plane by unfinished business. The Ghul predates these neat categories, these comfortable explanations. It belongs to a time before Islam brought structure to the Arabian Peninsula, before the great religions drew their lines between the sacred and the profane. In the pre-Islamic world, the desert was not empty. It teemed with invisible life, with entities that belonged neither to humanity nor to the divine order that would later be imposed upon them. To understand the Ghul, you must first understand the landscape that birthed it. The Arabian desert is not merely a place, it is a character in its own right, a vast and merciless entity that tests every living thing that dares to cross its face. By day, the sun becomes a weapon, beating down with such intensity that the very air shimmers with heat, creating mirages that lure the desperate toward non-existent water. By night, the temperature plummets, and the darkness becomes absolute. A crushing weight of shadow broken only by stars that seem impossibly distant, impossibly cold. In this environment, where a wrong turn means death and where water is more precious than gold, the human mind begins to see patterns in the chaos. It begins to populate the emptiness with explanations for the inexplicable. Why did the caravan find those travelers dead, their bodies torn and scattered, when no human enemy was near? Why do shapes move at the edge of vision, always disappearing when you turn to look directly? Why does the wind sometimes carry voices, calling your name with perfect clarity, drawing you away from the safety of the fire and into the consuming dark? The Ghul is the answer to these questions. It is the embodiment of the desert's power to deceive, to isolate, and to destroy. Ancient Arab poets, those who traversed these wastes and lived to compose their verses, spoke of the Ghul with a mixture of terror and respect. They understood it not as a supernatural anomaly, but as a fundamental truth of existence in the wilderness. The Ghul was as real as thirst, as inevitable as the scorpion's sting, as dangerous as losing one's way beneath the pitiless sky. But the Ghul possesses a cunning that elevates it beyond mere natural danger. This creature does not simply kill, it deceives. It wears faces that are not its own. It assumes forms calculated to exploit your deepest needs and desires. Lost in the wasteland, desperate for companionship, for guidance, for hope, the Ghul knows this, and it will appear to you as exactly what you seek. A beautiful woman, smiling, promising water and shelter, a fellow traveler, friendly and familiar, offering to show you the way. Even the ghost of a loved one, beckoning you to follow, to come closer, to step away from whatever fragile safety you have managed to construct. This is not random malevolence. This is intelligence, ancient and utterly alien to human morality. The Ghoul understands that humans are social creatures, that we crave connection even more than we crave survival. It weaponizes this vulnerability with precision. And once you follow, once you trust, once you allow it to lead you beyond the sight of your companions or the light of your fire, the mask drops. The beautiful face melts away, and you discover, in the final moments before the end, what the Ghoul truly is beneath its stolen skin. The creature that stands before us tonight in this narrative journey is neither good nor evil in the way we typically understand those concepts. It is primordial, operating according to laws that predate human ethics, human civilization, human language itself. To call it a monster is to impose our framework upon something that exists outside that framework entirely. The Ghoul simply is, as the desert is, as hunger is, as death is. And for thousands of years, those who lived in its territory learned to respect its existence, to understand its patterns, and to survive by knowing the rules of engagement with this shape-shifting predator of the graveyards and the wasteland. Join us as we pull back the veil on one of folklore's most enduring and terrifying figures. We will trace the Ghoul from the ancient poetry of the Jahiliyyah period through the immortal tales of the 1001 Nights, examine its transformation as it traveled westward into European Gothic literature, and discover how this Arabian nightmare has evolved into the ghouls that haunt our contemporary horror across every medium, from literature to film to gaming. But we begin here at the source, in the desert darkness where the Ghoul was born, from human fear and the unforgiving reality of survival at the edge of the known world. The fire is burning low. The night presses close, and somewhere out there, beyond the circle of light, something is watching. Something that knows how to wear the face you most want to see. This is the domain of the Ghoul, and you have just crossed its threshold. Long before the Ghoul appeared in written tales, long before scribes captured its essence on parchment, it lived in the verses of poets who traversed the Arabian wastes. These were the wandering bards of the Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance as it would later be called, the pre-Islamic period, when the desert tribes lived by codes of honor, tribal loyalty, and an acute awareness of the invisible forces that shared their harsh world. Their poetry was not entertainment, it was survival literature. An oral encyclopedia of knowledge passed from generation to generation around campfires that represented the only barrier between life and the consuming darkness beyond. The ancient Arab poets understood something fundamental about their craft. Poetry was memory made permanent through rhythm and repetition. In a largely pre-literate society, the poet served as historian, warner, and keeper of collective wisdom. When a poet spoke of the Ghoul, he was not spinning fiction for amusement. He was documenting a reality that every desert traveler understood with bone-deep certainty. The verses that mention these creatures were practical warnings disguised as art, teaching listeners how to recognize danger, what signs to heed, and how to survive an encounter with something that wanted to lead you to your death. One of the most famous early references comes from the poet Tabata Sharan, whose very name means "he who carries evil under his armpit," a title earned through his reputation as a fearless wanderer of the most dangerous territories. In his verses, he describes an encounter with a female Ghula in the wasteland, a being he discovers lurking near a water source. The poem is remarkable not for its supernatural elements, but for its clinical precision. Tabata Sharon describes the creature's behavior, its attempt to lure him, and his violent response with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting on a wolf or a venomous snake. This is not a ghost story, it is field observation. The poetry reveals patterns in how the ghoul manifests and operates. It appears most frequently at twilight or in the deep watches of night, those liminal hours when the human eye struggles to distinguish shape from shadow. It favors desolate places, locations where travelers are already vulnerable, water sources where the desperate must come despite the danger, abandoned structures that offer the false promise of shelter, and most tellingly, graveyards where the boundaries between life and death have already been compromised. The poets understood that the ghoul was not random in its hunting. It was strategic, exploiting human psychology and physical need with calculated precision. The verses also establish the ghoul's most terrifying characteristic, its mastery of the human form. The poets describe how it studies its prey, how it chooses an appearance designed to lower defenses and invite trust. For a lone traveler, it might become another wanderer, someone who seems to know the way through treacherous terrain. For a merchant caravan, it might appear as a woman in distress, appealing to cultural codes of honor that demanded protection of the vulnerable. The transformation is never perfect upon close inspection. The poets note subtle wrongness, eyes that reflect moonlight like an animal's, movements that seem slightly off, speech that feels rehearsed rather than natural. But in the desperation of survival, in the loneliness of endless isolation, these warnings are easy to ignore until it is far too late. What makes the pre-Islamic poetry particularly valuable is its geographical specificity. Different poets from different regions describe variations in ghoul behavior, suggesting either multiple subspecies or learned adaptations to local environments. In the northern deserts near Syria, the ghoul is described as favoring rocky outcrops and canyon systems, places where echoes could confuse and disorient. In the southern territories of Yemen, poets speak of ghouls that lurk near ancient ruins, wearing the faces of the long-dead civilizations that once thrived there. In the central Najd region, the creature is associated with dust storms and the disorienting fury of the Simoom wind, appearing when visibility drops to nothing and direction becomes meaningless. The poetry also reveals the complex relationship between humans and ghouls in this ancient worldview. These were not demons to be exorcised through prayer or ritual. They were part of the natural order, dangerous certainly, but no more supernatural than a sandstorm or a drought. The poets speak of the ghoul with the same respect they afford to any apex predator. They document its territories, its hunting patterns, its vulnerabilities. They note that fire seems to disturb it, that iron weapons can harm it, that certain invocations or protective verses can ward it away. This is not superstition. This is the accumulated wisdom of generations who lived alongside these creatures and developed strategies for coexistence. One particularly haunting verse, attributed to the poet Al-Shanfara, describes the ghoul as a fellow outcast, a being that, like the poet himself, exists at the margins of human society. Al-Shanfara was a suluk, an outlaw who rejected tribal protection and chose to live in the wilderness. In his famous Lamiyat al-Arab, he speaks of befriending the creatures of the wasteland, the wolf, the hyena, and yes, the ghoul. This suggests a profound understanding that the ghoul is not merely a monster, but a reflection of the desert itself, embodying the isolation, the deception, and the merciless hunger that characterizes survival in the harshest landscape on Earth. The verses that have survived to our era represent only a fraction of what once existed. Much of the oral tradition was lost when Islam brought literacy and a new cosmological framework that categorized the ghoul differently, placing it within the hierarchy of Jinn rather than treating it as a separate entity. But what remains gives us an invaluable window into how the earliest encounters with this creature were understood, not as brushes with the supernatural, but as documented confrontations with an intelligent predator that had mastered the ultimate camouflage, the human face itself. These poets were not writing horror stories. They were writing survival manuals in verse form, ensuring that their knowledge would be remembered, repeated, and passed down. Every time a traveler prepared to cross the desert, these poems would be recited, reminding them of what waited in the empty places, teaching them to question the friendly face that appears when you are most desperate, to doubt the voice that calls your name from beyond the firelight, to understand that in the wasteland, not everything that looks human is human, and not every offer of help leads to salvation. There exists a particular horror in the violation of the dead, a transgression that crosses boundaries so fundamental that nearly every human culture has developed elaborate rituals to protect the deceased from desecration. The grave is meant to be final, a place of rest where the body returns to earth under the protection of sacred ground, family vigilance, and the weight of taboo. But the Ghul recognizes no such boundaries. To understand this creature fully, we must confront its most disturbing characteristic: its appetite for human carrion and its deliberate dwelling among the tombs where it feeds without ceremony or restraint. In the Arabian tradition, the association between ghouls and graveyards is not incidental, it is definitional. The very word ghoul shares linguistic roots with terms meaning to seize, to overwhelm, to destroy. But in practice, the creature's relationship with burial grounds reveals something more complex than simple destruction. The ghoul is described in classical sources as a frequenter of cemeteries, a resident of the necropolis, something that has claimed the city of the dead as its rightful territory. This is not a scavenger that occasionally violates a grave. This is a predator that understands burial sites as hunting grounds, feeding stations, and domains where human authority holds no power. The mechanics of the ghoul's feeding, as described in folklore and early Islamic texts, are methodical and deeply disturbing. The creature does not simply consume flesh, it excavates graves with a purpose that suggests intelligence and preference. Accounts describe ghouls digging through burial soil with hands that seem designed for the task, unearthing the recently interred before decomposition has progressed too far. The preference for fresh corpses is consistent across sources, suggesting that the ghoul, despite its supernatural marae, is bound by certain physical requirements. It needs flesh that retains substance, bodies that have not yet returned entirely to dust. But the horror extends beyond mere consumption of the dead. The ghoul is credited with a kind of desecrating intelligence, an understanding of human burial customs that it exploits for maximum violation. In Islamic tradition, the body is washed, shrouded, and oriented toward Mecca, a sacred preparation for the afterlife. The ghoul's feeding undoes this careful ritual, scattering remains, destroying the integrity of burial, transforming the sacred back into the profane. This is why the creature inspires not just fear, but a particular species of revulsion. It attacks the dead at the moment when they are most vulnerable and most deserving of protection. The graveyard itself, in Arabian cosmology, occupies a liminal space. It is neither fully part of the living world nor entirely separate from it. It exists at a threshold, a place where families come to mourn and remember, where prayers are offered for the departed, but also where the boundary between this world and whatever lies beyond grows permeable. The ghoul thrives in this liminality. It is a creature of borders and crossings, and the cemetery represents the ultimate border, the place where life definitively ends and something else, something uncertain, begins. By claiming this territory, the ghoul positions itself as a guardian of sorts, not protecting the threshold, but exploiting it, Historical accounts from the early Islamic period suggest that the fear of ghoul predation on graves was practical, not merely symbolic. Cemetery guardians were employed not just to prevent human grave robbers, but to watch for signs of ghoul activity, disturbed earth, scattered grave goods, the distinctive tracks that did not quite match any known animal. Families of means would sometimes arrange for graves to be watched for the first 40 days after burial, the period when the body remained intact enough to attract these creatures. Iron spikes were driven into the earth around burial plots, not to keep the dead in, but to keep the ghoul out. The consumption of human flesh by the ghoul carries significance beyond the physical act. In Arabian thought, there existed a complex understanding of the relationship between body and soul, between the physical remains and whatever essence departed at death. By consuming the dead, the ghoul was believed to absorb not just substance, but something of the person themselves, memories perhaps, or the residual life force that clung to recently deceased flesh. Some traditions suggest that a ghoul could assume the appearance of someone it had consumed, adding that person's face to its repertoire of disguises, creating a nightmarish scenario where the creature could appear to grieving families wearing the features of their recently buried loved one. This aspect of ghoul mythology served a crucial social function in pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabia. It reinforced the importance of proper burial, of communal vigilance in protecting the dead, of maintaining the sanctity of the graveyard against all intrusions. The ghoul became the embodiment of what happens when these protective measures fail, when the community's duty to its dead is neglected, when graves are left unwatched and vulnerable. The creature thrived on abandonment, on forgotten cemeteries, on burial grounds that had lost their guardians and their sanctity. Yet there remains a troubling question at the heart of the ghoul's graveyard dwelling. Why does a creature capable of hunting the living, of luring travelers to their deaths through shape-shifting deception, also feed upon corpses? The answer reveals something profound about this entity. The ghoul is not merely a predator, it is a creature of dissolution and decay, something that exists at the intersection of death and transformation. It consumes the dead not out of necessity, but because it is fundamentally aligned with the process of returning flesh to the earth, of undoing the human form, of accelerating the inevitable decay that awaits us all. In this sense, the ghoul serves as a dark mirror to human mortality. We bury our dead with ceremony, mark their graves with stones, tell ourselves stories about rest and peace and continuation in another realm. The ghoul strips away these comforting fictions. It reveals the body as meat, the grave as a larder, death as a return to the food chain from which we briefly escaped through the illusion of civilization. This is perhaps why the creature's graveyard activities inspire such visceral horror, not because they're unnatural, but because they are too natural, too honest about the fate of flesh once the animating spirit has fled. Picture yourself alone in the vastness of the Arabian desert, days from the last oasis, your water supply dangerously low, your companions lost to a sandstorm that scattered your caravan like seeds in the wind. The sun has finally set, offering relief from the brutal heat, but bringing with it a darkness so complete that you can barely see your own hands. Your fire is small, your supplies nearly exhausted, and the silence of the wasteland presses against your ears with physical weight. Then, at the very edge of your firelight, you see a figure. A woman, beautiful beyond description, smiling at you with warmth and promise. She knows your name. She offers water, shelter, salvation. Every instinct screams that this is your miracle, your rescue. But a deeper, older part of your mind whispers the truth you do not want to hear. This is no miracle. This is the ghoul. The shape-shifting ability of the ghoul represents its most sophisticated and deadly weapon, a form of predation that transcends mere physical danger and enters the realm of psychological warfare. This is not the clumsy mimicry of a parrot repeating sounds it does not understand. This is precise, calculated deception, born from centuries of studying human behavior, human need, and human weakness. The Ghoul understands that humans are social creatures, hardwired to seek connection, to trust faces that appear friendly, to lower our defenses when presented with beauty, vulnerability, or the promise of companionship in isolation. It exploits these evolutionary adaptations with surgical precision. The classical sources describe the transformation process in fragments, each account adding pieces to an unsettling picture. The Ghoul does not simply assume a random human shape, it selects its disguise based on careful observation of its intended prey. It watches from the darkness, learning what will most effectively breach your defenses. For a merchant traveling alone, it might become a fellow trader, someone who seems to know the routes and can offer guidance. For a young man far from home, it transforms into a woman of stunning beauty, appealing to loneliness and desire. For a mother separated from her children, it takes the form of a lost child crying in the darkness, knowing that maternal instinct will override caution. The most common manifestation, repeated across countless tales and warnings, is that of the beautiful woman appearing to male travelers in the wilderness. This is no accident of folklore. It represents a calculated exploitation of multiple vulnerabilities simultaneously. The isolated traveler is not merely lonely, he is psychologically vulnerable. Worn down by days or weeks of solitude, his judgment compromised by exhaustion, thirst, and the creeping madness that the desert inflicts on the unprepared mind. When the Ghoul appears as a woman, she offers more than companionship. She offers validation, rescue, hope, and the possibility of escape from the crushing reality of his situation. But the disguise is never quite perfect, and this imperfection is crucial to understanding the Ghouls. The creature is intelligent, but it is not human. It can approximate the human form, study human expressions, mimic human speech patterns, but something always remains fundamentally wrong. The eyes might catch the firelight wrong, reflecting like an animal's rather than absorbing light the way human eyes do. The movements might be too smooth, too fluid, lacking the small imperfections and hesitations that characterize genuine human motion. The voice, while capable of speech, might have an odd cadence, a rehearsed quality, as though the Ghoul is reciting lines learned by rote rather than speaking from genuine thought. These telltale signs appear in the cautionary tales passed down through generations. The poets and storytellers emphasize these details not for dramatic effect, but as practical survival information. They taught desert travelers to look for these inconsistencies, to question the convenient rescue that appears exactly when needed, to maintain skepticism even when every fiber of your being wants to believe in the salvation being offered. The advice was simple but psychologically demanding. When a stranger appears in the wasteland offering help, examine them carefully before accepting. Look at the eyes. Listen to the rhythm of speech. Watch how they move. And above all, never follow them away from your fire, away from your camp, away from the thin margin of safety you have managed to establish. The psychological dimension of this predation cannot be overstated. The Ghoul does not simply kill, it betrays. It weaponizes trust, exploits hope, and transforms the fundamental human need for connection into a fatal liability. The victim dies, not merely from physical violence, but from the crushing realization that their salvation was a lie, that the rescue they believed in was actually the instrument of their destruction. This betrayal is part of the predation. The moment when the victim understands they have been deceived is the moment when resistance collapses. when the will to fight or flee evaporates in the face of complete psychological defeat. This aspect of Ghoul mythology speaks to a profound truth about survival in hostile environments. The desert kills through deception as much as through direct danger. Mirages promise water that does not exist. Familiar landmarks shift and disappear in the heat shimmer. Distances become impossible to judge. The mind, desperate for patterns and meaning, begins to see what it wants to see rather than what is actually there. The Ghoul embodies this principle of desert deception, becoming a living manifestation of the environment's ability to exploit human psychology, to turn our greatest survival adaptations, pattern recognition, social bonding, trust in our senses, into vectors for our destruction. In the taxonomy of Arabian folklore, where precise language carries the weight of survival, the distinction between Ghul and Ghula is not a mere grammatical curiosity. It represents a fundamental understanding that these creatures, like humans, manifest in gendered forms, each with distinct behaviors, hunting patterns, and degrees of danger. The masculine Ghul and the feminine Ghula are not interchangeable variants of the same entity. They are separate expressions of a predatory intelligence that has learned to exploit different vulnerabilities in human psychology and social structure. To understand this division is to understand how deeply the ancient Arabs observed and categorized the threats that haunted their world. The Ghul, in its masculine form, is most frequently described as a solitary hunter of the deep wilderness, a creature that dwells in the most remote and desolate regions where human presence is rare and always temporary. This entity does not typically employ the elaborate seductions attributed to its female counterpart. Instead, it relies on ambush, on sudden appearance, on overwhelming force. The masculine Ghoul is portrayed as physically imposing when it drops its disguise, a being of considerable size and strength, capable of overpowering even armed men. Its hunting strategy involves isolating individuals from groups, exploiting moments of vulnerability when a traveler separates from companions to relieve themselves, to scout ahead, or to search for lost animals in the darkness. The Ghula, by contrast, is the form most embedded in cautionary tales about seduction and betrayal. She is the beautiful woman who appears to solitary male travelers, the seemingly helpless female who requests aid, the alluring figure who promises pleasure and comfort in exchange for following her away from safety. The Ghula's power lies not in physical dominance, but in psychological manipulation, in her ability to read desire and desperation to present herself as the answer to unspoken prayers. Where the masculine Ghoul might simply attack, the feminine Ghula prefers to lure, to lead astray, to draw her victims willingly into situations where they become vulnerable. The gendered of these manifestations reflects the social realities of pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabian society. Men were the travelers, the caravan guards, the warriors who found themselves isolated in dangerous territories. The Ghula's strategy of appearing as a woman exploited specific cultural dynamics. The code of honor that demanded men protect women who appeared to be in distress. The loneliness of long journeys away from family and community, and the simple biological reality of desire that could override rational caution in a mind worn down by hardship. The Ghula understood these pressure points with predatory precision. But the distinction goes deeper than mere hunting strategy. The feminine Ghula is more consistently associated with graveyards and the consumption of corpses, appearing in sources as the primary dweller in cemeteries, the one who excavates graves and feeds upon the recently buried. This association connects the Ghula to themes of fertility and corruption, of life-giving femininity inverted into death-dealing predation. She represents a dark mirror of motherhood and nurturing, consuming rather than creating, destroying the dead rather than bringing forth the living. This inversion made the Ghula particularly horrifying in a cultural context where feminine identity was strongly tied to life-giving roles. The differences in vulnerability are also significant. Folklore suggests that the masculine Ghul, while dangerous, is more straightforwardly confronted. A warrior with weapons, courage, and knowledge of protective prayers could potentially defeat or drive off a Ghul in direct combat. Iron weapons are effective. Fire causes the creature to retreat, and certain Quranic verses possess protective power. The masculine form, for all its physical danger, operates according to rules that can be learned and countered through preparation and bravery. The Ghula, however, is portrayed as more insidious and harder to defend against, precisely because her primary weapon is not physical force, but deception. How do you fight an enemy that wears the face of rescue? How do you maintain vigilance against a threat that appears as the fulfillment of hope? The defenses against the Ghula require not just physical preparedness, but constant psychological discipline. The ability to question your own perceptions, to doubt what you most want to believe, to maintain suspicion even when it feels cruel or paranoid. This makes the feminine form perhaps more dangerous in practice because the skills required to survive an encounter are not martial, but mental. Some regional variations suggest that Ghul and Ghula could form pairs or family groups, with offspring that inherited the shape-shifting abilities and predatory of their parents. These accounts describe entire clans of Ghouls dwelling in remote canyon systems or abandoned cities, creating a truly nightmarish scenario where travelers might stumble into a community of these creatures rather than facing a single entity. The gendered distinction becomes important here too, with male and female Ghouls serving different functions within these groups. Males as hunters and guards, females as lures and feeders. The persistence of this gendered division in Ghul folklore reveals something profound about how pre-Islamic Arabs understood danger. They recognized that threats come in different forms, that the same fundamental predatory intelligence might manifest in ways that require different defenses. The Ghul is the danger you can see and fight, the ambush predator that attacks from darkness but can be countered with steel and fire. The Ghula is the danger you invite, the predator that walks through your defenses because you open the door yourself. Both are deadly, but they kill in fundamentally different ways, and survival requires understanding which face the Ghul has chosen to wear. There exists a collection of stories so vast, so intricate, and so deeply woven into the fabric of world literature that its influence cannot be measured, only marveled at. The Arabian Nights, known also as 1001 Nights, stands as one of humanity's great narrative achievements. A compendium of tales gathered across centuries from Persian, Indian, and Arabian sources, unified by the frame story of Scheherazade, the brilliant woman who saves her own life through the power of storytelling. Within this labyrinth of narratives, nested stories within stories, the Ghul finds its most enduring literary expression, transformed from oral tradition and poetic fragments into written tales that would carry the creature's essence across languages, cultures, and centuries. The genius of the Arabian Nights lies in its structure, the way Scheherazade must constantly defer the ending of each tale to survive another day, creating a narrative tension that mirrors the very survival strategies the stories often depict. She is, in essence, doing what desert travelers did when confronting the Ghul, using wit, knowledge, and careful observation to navigate deadly danger. The tales she tells often feature characters who must similarly use intelligence rather than force to survive encounters with supernatural beings. And the Ghul appears repeatedly as a test of both courage and cunning, a creature that can be defeated, but never through simple violence alone. One of the most famous ghoul encounters in the collection appears in the tale of Sidi Numan. In this story, a merchant discovers that his beautiful young wife disappears each night, slipping away after he falls asleep. Consumed by suspicion, he feigns sleep one evening and follows her through the darkened streets of Baghdad. She leads him to a cemetery where, to his absolute horror, he witnesses her joining a gathering of ghouls who are excavating graves and feasting upon corpses. His wife, the woman he shares his bed with, the person he trusted above all others, is revealed to be a ghula who has been maintaining human disguise to access the comforts of civilized life, while satisfying her true under cover of darkness. The tale of Sidi Numan captures several crucial elements of ghoul mythology within a narrative framework that makes the abstract horror concrete and personal. The violation is not happening to strangers in the distant desert, it is happening in the heart of a great city, in the most intimate relationship possible. The ghula is not a distant threat, but a domestic one, sleeping beside you, eating at your table, wearing the face of love while harboring appetites that would make you flee in terror if you knew the truth. This domestication of the horror makes it somehow worse, more psychologically penetrating than tales of wilderness encounters. Another significant appearance occurs in the story of the third calendar, where a prince fleeing misfortune takes shelter in what appears to be an abandoned building in the wilderness. There, he encounters a beautiful woman who seems to be a fellow refugee, and they share food and conversation through the night. But as dawn approaches, she transforms, revealing herself as a ghula who intended to add him to her diet once he was sufficiently off guard. The prince survives only through quick thinking, reciting protective verses and brandishing an iron blade, driving the creature back into the wilderness from which she emerged. This tale emphasizes the importance of spiritual protection and knowledge, suggesting that survival requires more than physical courage. The Arabian Nights does something crucial for the preservation and evolution of ghoul mythology. It standardizes certain elements while allowing for variation, creating a kind of canonical framework that future storytellers could work within or against. The shape-shifting ability becomes codified, the graveyard association is reinforced, the vulnerability to iron and sacred words is established as consistent across multiple tales. Yet within this framework, each story explores different facets of the ghouls, different scenarios of encounter, different methods of survival or failure. Shaherazade's presentation of these tales also adds a metatextual layer that is easy to overlook but deeply significant. She is telling stories to a king who has been betrayed by his wife, who has developed a pathological distrust of women, who executes each new bride after a single night to prevent future betrayal. The Ghula tales, with their emphasis on female creatures who wear masks of beauty while concealing monstrous appetites, speak directly to the king's fears. But Scheherazade herself is demonstrating the opposite truth, that women possess not monstrous hunger, but transformative power through wisdom and storytelling. She is, in effect, using tales of false women to prove herself a true one, a brilliant inversion that adds psychological depth to the entire collection. The literary immortality granted to the ghoul through the Arabian Nights cannot be overstated. When these stories were translated into European languages, beginning with Antoine Galland's French translation in the early 18th century, they became immediate sensations. European audiences, raised on their own folklore of vampires, werewolves, and witches, encountered the ghoul as something simultaneously familiar and exotic. It was a corpse-eater like the vampire, a shapeshifter like the werewolf, but it carried the intoxicating flavor of the Orient, of desert mysteries and Arabian wisdom. The creature was no longer confined to oral tradition or classical Arabic texts. It had entered world literature. The tales also preserved crucial details that might otherwise have been lost as oral traditions faded. The specific behaviors of the Ghul, its preference for certain types of victims, the times and places it was most dangerous, the exact of its vulnerabilities, all of this was encoded in narrative form within stories that proved so compelling they would be retold, translated, and adapted for centuries. The Arabian Nights became a bridge, carrying the Ghul from its ancient origins into modernity, ensuring that even as the desert tribes who first named these creatures settled into cities and their oral traditions weakened, the knowledge would persist. But perhaps most importantly, the Arabian Nights demonstrated that the Ghul was more than a monster. It was a narrative device, a symbolic figure that could carry meaning beyond simple horror. In these tales, the Ghul represents betrayal, hidden, the gap between appearance and reality. It serves as a warning about trust, about the importance of vigilance, about the reality that danger often wears an attractive face. These themes are universal, which is why the Ghul could travel so successfully across cultural boundaries, why it could be adopted and adapted by traditions far removed from the Arabian desert where it was born. To understand the Ghul's place in the cosmology of Arabian and Islamic tradition, we must first understand the Jinn, those beings of smokeless fire who occupy a realm parallel to our own, invisible yet intimately connected to the world of human experience. The Jinn are not demons in the Christian sense, nor are they angels or ghosts. They are a separate creation, beings with intelligence, free will, and the capacity for both good and evil, existing in a dimension that overlaps with ours, but remains largely hidden from human perception. The Quran acknowledges their existence explicitly, placing them within the divine order as creatures created before humans, fashioned from fire, while humanity was formed from clay. Within this complex hierarchy of the unseen, the question arises, what exactly is the Ghul? Is it a type of Jinn, a corrupted variant, or something else entirely? The relationship between Ghouls and Jinn is one of the most debated aspects of Islamic demonology and Arabian folklore. Some scholars and traditions classify the Ghul as a subspecies of Jinn, specifically those Jinn who have chosen evil paths, who dwell in desolate places, and who prey upon humans. This interpretation places the Ghul within the broader category of malevolent Jinn, known as the shayatin, the devils or evil spirits who oppose divine order and seek to lead humanity astray. Under this framework, the Ghul's shape-shifting abilities, its intelligence, and its supernatural all derive from its essential identity as a fireborn spirit with capabilities far beyond those of physical creatures. The Quran itself mentions the Jinn's ability to assume various forms, to become invisible, to travel vast distances instantaneously, and to possess knowledge hidden from human senses. These capabilities align closely with the attributes traditionally ascribed to the Ghul. The creature's power to transform into human or animal shapes would be explained by the fundamental of Jinn as beings not bound by fixed physical form. Their ability to appear and disappear, to know a traveler's name without introduction, to understand human psychology well enough to exploit it. All of these traits make sense if the Ghul is understood as a particularly predatory variety of Jinn, rather than a separate category of entity. However, alternative traditions suggest a more complex relationship. Some classical sources treat the Ghul as a distinct class of creature that may interact with Jinn, but is not necessarily of Jinn origin. These accounts describe Ghouls as beings that predate Islamic revelation, entities that belong to the pre-Islamic Arabian cosmology, and were later incorporated into Islamic understanding rather than being native to it. This interpretation views the Ghul as something older, perhaps more primal, a creature that Islam acknowledged and classified, but did not create through its theological framework. the linguistic evidence adds another layer to this mystery. The word Ghul appears in pre-Islamic poetry, with connotations that suggest it was already a well-established category before the coming of Islam. The poets spoke of ghouls in ways that distinguished them from other supernatural entities, suggesting that in the popular understanding of the time, these were recognized as something specific, not merely as generic evil spirits. When Islam arrived and brought with it the concept of jinn as a formal theological category, there may have been an effort to reconcile existing folklore with the new religious framework, resulting in the ambiguous classification that persists to this day. Certain hadith, the recorded sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, provide fascinating insight into this relationship. There are accounts of the Prophet speaking about ghouls in ways that acknowledge their existence, but also diminish their power through the assertion of divine protection. One famous hadith states that if a person recites certain verses from the Quran, particularly Ayat al-Kursi, the verse of the throne, they are protected from both jinn and ghoul. This grouping suggests that while ghouls may be related to jinn, they are distinct enough to warrant separate mention, yet similar enough to be warded off by the same spiritual protections. The concept of marriage between jinn and humans, acknowledged in Islamic tradition, further complicates the picture. If jinn can take human form convincingly enough to enter into relationships with humans, could a ghoul do the same? The tales of ghouls disguised as beautiful women, who become wives to unsuspecting men, might represent not deception for the purpose of immediate predation, but actual unions between human and supernatural, producing offspring that inherit characteristics from both lineages. Some folklore speaks of children born with unusual abilities or strange appetites, explained as the result of one parent being jinn or ghoul, suggesting a biological component that goes beyond mere shape-shifting illusion. The theological implications are profound. If ghouls are jinn, then they possess free will and are accountable for their actions in the divine scheme. Some might choose righteousness, though tradition holds that most ghouls are among the most wicked of jinn. But if ghouls are something else, perhaps beings created before the jinn, or corrupted forms of jinn who have lost their original, then their moral status becomes more ambiguous. Are they damned by choice or by? Can a ghoul repent and be saved? Or is it locked into its predatory existence by fundamental essence rather than decision? The practical impact of this classification affected how people defended themselves. Protection against jinn involves specific prayers, the recitation of Quranic verses, the use of particular names of God, and the maintenance of ritual purity. These same defenses were applied against ghouls, suggesting that whatever their precise, they responded to the same spiritual countermeasures. Iron, fire, and certain spoken formulas all held power over both jinn and ghoul, indicating a shared vulnerability that might derive from a shared. What remains clear across all interpretations is that the ghoul occupies a liminal space in Arabian cosmology, whether as the darkest expression of jinn or as a separate category of being that shares characteristics with jinn. It represents the dangerous, the predatory, the aspect of the invisible world that actively seeks human destruction rather than merely coexisting in parallel with humanity. The ghoul is not a neutral force like the desert itself, nor is it a spirit that might be bargained with or appeased. It is hunger given intelligence, deception given form, death wearing the mask of salvation. Whether we classify it as jinn or not, its essential remains unchanged. A reminder that the unseen world contains entities whose relationship with humanity is fundamentally predatory. Knowledge is the first line of defense against any predator, and in the case of the ghoul, that knowledge was hard-won through centuries of encounters, deaths, and the oral transmission of what worked and what failed. The desert peoples who shared their territory with these shape-shifting creatures developed a practical understanding of their vulnerabilities, not through mystical revelation, but through careful observation and the brutal process of trial and error. Two elements emerged as consistently effective against the Ghul: iron and fire. These were not magical talismans requiring ritual or incantation. They were tangible, physical substances whose properties seemed to disrupt the ghouls at a fundamental level, forcing it to retreat or causing it genuine harm. Iron holds a special place in folklore across countless cultures, from the Celtic lands where fairies fear its touch to the Arabian deserts where Jinn and ghouls recoil from its presence. The reasons for iron's protective power are debated among scholars, but in practical terms, what matters is that it works. Arabian travelers learned to carry iron weapons, not just for defense against human bandits, but specifically for encounters with supernatural threats. A blade of iron, even a simple knife, could wound a ghoul in ways that bronze or stone could not. The creature's shape-shifting flesh, so adept at transforming from human beauty to monstrous form, seemed unable to properly heal from iron wounds, as though the metal poisoned the supernatural essence that allowed the transformation. The effectiveness of iron extended beyond weapons to protective applications. Travelers would hammer iron stakes into the ground around their campsites, creating a perimeter that ghouls seemed reluctant to cross. Iron horseshoes were nailed above doorways in settled areas where ghoul activity had been reported, the same practice seen in European protection against evil spirits. Women would wear iron jewelry, particularly around the neck and wrists, as defense against ghula who might attempt possession or attack. These practices were not superstition, they were practical applications of observed effectiveness, folk developed through generations of living alongside supernatural predators. The specific quality of iron that repels the ghoul remains mysterious. Some Islamic scholars suggested that iron, being a metal explicitly mentioned in the Quran as a gift from God containing both great strength and benefit for mankind, carries a kind of divine sanction that supernatural beings created from smokeless fire cannot tolerate. Others proposed more material explanations, that the magnetic properties of iron disrupt the subtle energies that allow shape-shifting and materialization, or that iron's association with blood through the element's role in hemoglobin creates a resonance that repels creatures who feed on the dead rather than the living. Fire, the second great weapon against the ghoul, operates through different mechanisms, but with equal effectiveness. Unlike iron, which must make physical contact, fire creates a barrier through presence and threat. Ghouls are described as deeply averse to flame, avoiding campfires and torchlight, attacking only when fires burn low or when victims are lured away from illuminated areas. This fear is not merely a preference for darkness or an aversion to being seen. Fire appears to cause the ghoul genuine pain and distress. Accounts of successful defenses against ghoul attacks frequently mention the use of torches, burning brands, or the spreading of fire as means of driving the creature away. The relationship between fire and the ghouls reveals interesting theological dimensions. If ghouls are indeed a form of jinn, beings created from smokeless fire, why would they fear flame? One interpretation holds that the ghoul represents corrupted or inverted jinn, and thus the pure fire from which they were originally created has become anathema to their degraded state. Another view suggests that fire represents transformation and purification, qualities that the ghoul, as an entity of decay and consumption, fundamentally opposes. Fire transforms dead matter into ash and smoke, denying the ghoul its food source and perhaps threatening to unmake the creature itself through a return to primordial elemental form. Practical applications of fire as defense took many forms. The most basic was the maintenance of a strong fire throughout the night when traveling through Ghul territory. Travelers learned never to let their fires burn too low, feeding them steadily with whatever fuel could be found, accepting the trade-off between conserving resources and maintaining protection. Groups would post guards specifically to tend the fire, understanding that a dying flame represented the opening of a door through which the Ghul might enter. When a Ghul was suspected nearby, spreading oil and setting it alight could create barriers of flame that the creature would not cross. Beyond iron and fire, certain verbal protections held power. The recitation of specific Quranic verses, particularly those affirming divine protection and authority over all creation, could ward off Ghul attacks. The most commonly cited was Ayat al-Kursi, the throne verse from Surah al-Baqarah, which establishes God's dominion over all that exists in the heavens and earth. Travelers would recite this verse before sleeping, upon encountering anything suspicious, and when feeling the presence of unseen threats. The protection offered was not mechanical but spiritual, asserting divine authority over the supernatural realm and placing oneself under that protection. The name of God itself, invoked properly, could disrupt Ghul attacks. Stories tell of travelers who, finding themselves in the grip of a revealed Ghul, spoke the names of Allah with conviction and faith, causing the creature to release them and flee. This was not magic in the sense of manipulation of supernatural forces, but rather an appeal to the fundamental hierarchy of existence, reminding the Ghul that it too existed within divine order and was subject to that authority regardless of its predatory or supernatural capabilities. Combining these defenses created the most effective protection. A traveler who carried iron weapons maintained fire through the night and fortified himself with prayer and recitation of protective verses stood the best chance of surviving passage through Ghul territory. But knowledge alone was insufficient. These defenses required discipline, constant vigilance, and the psychological strength to maintain caution even when exhaustion, thirst, and the desperate hope for rescue made one vulnerable to the beautiful face appearing at the edge of firelight, promising salvation, but delivering only death. The Arabian desert is not merely a setting for Ghul encounters. It is an active participant in the horror, a landscape so extreme in its hostility that it becomes impossible to separate the environment from the creature it produces. To understand the Ghul fully, you must first understand the desert itself, not as a romantic backdrop of endless dunes and exotic mystery, but as one of the most psychologically and physically punishing environments on Earth. This is a place where the temperature can swing 70 degrees between noon and midnight, where water sources are separated by distances that exceed human endurance, where a wrong turn or a sandstorm can erase all landmarks and leave you wandering in circles until thirst or exposure claims your life. The desert does not need the Ghul to kill you, but the Ghul has evolved perfectly to exploit the specific vulnerabilities that desert survival creates. Consider the psychological impact of true isolation in the vastness of empty space. Human beings are not designed for such extremes of solitude. Our brains evolved in social groups where cooperation meant survival and exile meant death. When you travel alone through the desert, separated from your caravan by storm or misfortune, cut off from the sound of human voices and the comfort of companionship, your mind begins to change. Studies of isolation and sensory deprivation show that the human psyche starts to fracture without social input, creating hallucinations, phantom voices, and the overwhelming sensation of presence, the feeling that something is near, even when nothing can be seen. The desert creates these conditions naturally, and the Ghul has learned to exploit them with predatory precision. The physical environment enhances this psychological vulnerability. During the day, the sun becomes an enemy of perception. Heat shimmer creates mirages, bending light until distant features appear close, and nearby objects seem to float above the ground. Water that does not exist gleams with convincing reality on the horizon. Rock formations twist into shapes that resemble human figures, camel caravans, fortified settlements, all of which dissolve into formless stone when approached. The desert teaches you that your eyes cannot be trusted, that what you see is often a lie told by physics and desperation. When the ghoul appears wearing a false face, you have already been conditioned by the landscape itself to doubt your own perception. Night brings different terrors. The temperature plummets, and with it comes a darkness more absolute than most modern humans have ever experienced. There are no distant city lights to dilute the void, no street lamps, no glow of civilization on any horizon. The darkness is complete, broken only by stars that seem impossibly bright, yet offer no practical illumination. Your fire becomes the entire world, a tiny bubble of light and warmth surrounded by infinite blackness. Beyond that circle of protection, anything could be moving, watching, approaching. The ghoul understands that in such darkness, your imagination becomes an ally in its predation. The fear is already present. The creature merely has to step into the shape that fear has prepared. The acoustic properties of the desert add another layer of disorientation. In some areas, particularly among rock formations and canyon systems, sounds echo in ways that make it impossible to determine direction or distance. A voice calling your name might seem to come from directly ahead when its source is actually behind you. The wind moving through stone passages can produce sounds uncannily similar to human speech or animal cries. You learn that your ears, like your eyes, are unreliable instruments in this landscape. When the ghoul calls to you using a familiar voice, you have already been taught by the environment itself that sounds lie, that direction is meaningless, that the desert speaks with false tongues. The absence of reliable water sources creates a specific vulnerability that the ghoul exploits masteriously. Thirst is not merely discomfort. It is a cognitive impairment that progressively destroys judgment and perception. As dehydration advances, the brain begins to shut down higher functions, impairing decision-making, weakening willpower, and eventually producing delirium. A traveler in the advanced stages of thirst becomes incapable of the careful skepticism required to detect a ghoul's deception. The promise of water, the appearance of someone who claims to know where water can be found, becomes irresistible. The ghoul does not need elaborate disguises when confronting a dying man. It needs only to promise the one thing he cannot refuse. The seasonal sandstorms, the simoon winds that can arise with terrifying speed, create conditions of perfect vulnerability. Visibility drops to zero, navigation becomes impossible, and the most experienced desert traveler can become lost within sight of his own camp. These storms can last for hours or days, forcing travelers to hunker down and wait, separated from companions, disoriented, exhausted. When the storm clears, the landscape has been transformed. Familiar landmarks are buried or reshaped. Tracks are erased. And in this confusion, when you are trying desperately to determine direction and locate your group, the ghoul appears. Someone who seems to know the way. Someone offering to lead you to safety. Someone who is, in fact, leading you to your death. The desert also breeds a particular quality of silence that is psychologically corrosive. This is not the comfortable quiet of a library or bedroom. It is an oppressive absence of sound that feels like pressure against your eardrums. No birds call, no insects buzz, no leaves rustle. Because in the deep desert, there is often no life at all beyond what you have brought with you. In such silence, the slightest sound becomes magnified into significance. The crack of cooling rocks becomes footsteps. The whisper of wind becomes voices. Your own breathing seems loud enough to alert every predator within miles. The ghoul moves through this silence with practice born of millennia, and when it chooses to make sound, to call your name or offer greeting, that sound strikes with the force of revelation, because it breaks a silence that has become nearly unbearable. The desert, then, is not neutral ground where humans and ghouls happen to encounter each other. It is the ghoul's accomplice, preparing victims through physical hardship, psychological isolation, sensory deception, and cognitive impairment. The landscape softens you, breaks down your defenses, teaches you to doubt your own senses, and delivers you into a state where the ghoul's deception becomes not just possible, but nearly inevitable. The creature has evolved alongside this environment, becoming perfectly adapted to exploit every vulnerability that the desert creates. To cross the wasteland alone is to place yourself in a killing zone designed by geology and climate, patrolled by an intelligence that has learned to weaponize the landscape itself. The moment when the ghoul crossed from Arabian consciousness into European awareness represents one of the most fascinating instances of cultural transmission in the history of folklore. This was not a gradual diffusion or an organic spread through neighboring cultures. It was a sudden introduction through the vehicle of translation, specifically Antoine Galland's French rendering of the Arabian Nights in the early 1700s. European readers, already steeped in their own traditions of vampires, werewolves, and revenants, encountered the ghoul as something simultaneously familiar and profoundly foreign. It was a corpse-eater like their own undead legends, yet it came wrapped in the exotic mystique of the Orient, carrying with it the scent of desert nights and the architecture of Islamic cosmology. The creature that Europeans adopted was not quite the same as the Arabian original. Translation is always transformation, but the essential core survived the journey. Galland's translation work, completed between 1704 and 1717, arrived in Europe during a period of intense fascination with all things Oriental. This was the age of Orientalism, when European intellectuals, artists, and audiences consumed tales and images from the Islamic world with an appetite that mixed genuine curiosity with colonial condescension and romantic fantasy. The Arabian Nights became an immediate sensation, translated from Galland's French into English, German, and other European languages, spreading the tales of Scheherazade across the continent. Within these stories, the ghoul appeared not as folklore, but as established fact within the narrative world, a creature whose existence the tales took for granted rather than questioned. The linguistic transformation itself is worth examining. The Arabic ghoul became the French ghoul, which entered English as ghoul by the mid-1800s. The word carried its exotic origins openly, the unusual spelling and pronunciation marking it as foreign, other, something imported from distant lands rather than native to European tradition. This foreignness became part of the creature's appeal. European audiences were tired of their own monsters. Overfamiliar vampires and werewolves had lost some of their power to terrify through centuries of repetition. The ghoul offered freshness, a new category of horror that operated by different rules and suggested different meanings. Early European adaptations began almost immediately to reshape the ghoul according to local sensibilities and existing folklore patterns. The shape-shifting aspect, so central to Arabian tradition, was sometimes downplayed or eliminated entirely in favor of emphasizing the creature as a straightforward corpse-eater dwelling in graveyards. This aligned the ghoul more closely with European grave robber traditions and legends of ghouls who fed upon the dead. The seduction element, the beautiful woman luring travelers to their doom, was interpreted through European frameworks of succubi and fairy enchantments, rather than understood in its original context of desert survival and psychological warfare. The cemetery association resonated particularly strongly with European audiences because it tapped into anxieties that were culturally specific to the period. The 18 and 1900s saw European cities struggling with burial space as urban populations exploded. Overcrowded graveyards, mass graves, and the grim profession of resurrection, men who illegally exhumed bodies for medical schools, created a cultural atmosphere where the violation of graves was not merely horrific fantasy, but disturbing reality. The ghoul, as a creature that desecrated burial grounds and consumed the dead, became a perfect vessel for these anxieties, a monster that literalized the fear that the dead were not safe, even in consecrated ground. Gothic literature, that peculiarly European genre that flourished in the late 1700s and throughout the 1800s, found in the ghoul a useful addition to its bestiary of horrors. Writers like Matthew Lewis, Charles Maturin, and later Edgar Allan Poe incorporated ghoul-like creatures into their works, though often without using the name explicitly. The ghoul's characteristics, its dwelling among tombs, its consumption of corpses, its ability to deceive, all appeared in Gothic fiction as elements that could be mixed with vampiric and demonic traits to create hybrid monsters suited to European sensibilities and Christian theological frameworks. The transformation of the ghoul in its westward journey reveals how folklore adapts when crossing cultural boundaries. Elements that made perfect sense in the Arabian context, the desert setting, the relationship to Jinn cosmology, the specific social dynamics of caravan travel were largely lost or misunderstood by European audiences. What remained were the aspects that could be mapped onto existing European categories. The ghoul became a type of undead, closely associated with vampires and revenants. Its shapeshifting became less about survival strategy in hostile environments and more about supernatural malevolence for its own sake. The creature was domesticated, made to fit within European narrative structures and theological assumptions. Yet, something essential survived the translation. The ghoul retained its association with the violation of death's sanctity, with the horror of the corpse-eater, with the idea that danger can wear a false face. These core elements proved universal enough to transcend cultural boundaries because they tap into fears that are fundamentally human rather than culturally specific. Every society must deal with death, must create rituals around the disposal and honoring of the dead, and must grapple with the horror of that sanctity being violated. The ghoul, whether in Arabian or European form, embodies that violation. The journey west also created a feedback loop that would eventually affect Arabian culture itself. As European colonial powers increased their presence in the Middle East throughout the 19 and early 2000s, European interpretations of Arabian folklore, including the ghoul, circulated back to the regions of origin. Arabian writers and filmmakers in the 20th century sometimes drew upon these European reinterpretations, creating a complex layering where the creature was influenced by how Europeans had reimagined it. The ghoul became a site of cultural exchange and mutual influence, no longer purely Arabian or European, but something hybrid, a monster that belonged to multiple traditions simultaneously while remaining distinct within each. The Victorian era, that period of industrial transformation and imperial expansion spanning much of the 19th century, possessed a peculiar obsession with death that created the perfect cultural environment for the ghoul to flourish in its reimagined European form. This was an age when mourning became an elaborate social performance, when photography of the deceased became common practice, when spiritualism promised communication with the dead, and when the growing cities struggled to accommodate the sheer volume of corpses produced by overcrowding, disease, and the brutal realities of industrial labor. Into this atmosphere of death anxiety and morbid fascination, the ghoul emerged as a Gothic monster, perfectly suited to embody Victorian fears about the violation of burial sanctity and the thin line between the living and the dead. The Victorian cemetery itself became a central location in Gothic literature and popular imagination. unlike the scattered churchyard graveyards of earlier periods, Victorian cities created vast necropolises on their outskirts, elaborate garden cemeteries designed as parks for the dead, where the living could stroll among monuments and contemplate mortality in cultivated surroundings. But these beautiful death gardens also represented practical anxieties. The older urban churchyards were literally overflowing, with bodies buried in layers, coffins stacked atop one another, and the earth itself saturated with decomposition. Stories circulated of graves that collapsed, revealing their contents, of cemetery walls that cracked and leaked, of the ground itself becoming unstable from the mass of buried flesh beneath. Into this context, the resurrection men, those grave robbers who supplied corpses to medical schools for anatomical study, represented a very real violation of the dead. These were not supernatural monsters, but human predators who desecrated graves for profit, who treated the deceased as commodities rather than sacred remains. The public horror at resurrection activities was profound, leading to riots when body-snatching rings were discovered and contributing to the passage of the Anatomy Act of 1832 in Britain, which attempted to provide legal sources for anatomical specimens. But the damage to public confidence was done. The grave was no longer inviolable, and the ghoul, as a supernatural grave robber and corpse eater, became a perfect symbol for these anxieties. Gothic literature of the Victorian period embraced the ghoul with enthusiasm, though often without using the specific name. The creature appeared under various guises in the works of writers who understood its symbolic potency. The ghoul represented the fear that death was not an ending, but a transition into vulnerability. That the body you hoped would rest in peace might instead be violated, consumed, stolen, or desecrated. This fear took many forms in Gothic fiction, from vampires who rose from their graves to feed on the living, to unnamed creatures that haunted cemeteries and fed upon the dead, to human monsters whose depravity led them to necrophilia and worse violations. The physical description of the Victorian ghoul evolved to match European sensibilities and Gothic aesthetic conventions. Where the Arabian Ghul was often described as capable of beautiful disguises, the European Gothic ghoul became increasingly associated with decay and corruption. It was imagined as pale and corpse-like, with elongated limbs and fingers adapted for digging through grave soil. Its eyes were often described as luminous, glowing with an unhealthy light in the darkness of the cemetery. The mouth was emphasized, filled with sharp teeth, or unnaturally wide to accommodate its feeding habits. This physical grotesqueness aligned the ghoul more closely with European traditions of monstrous undead, rather than the shape-shifting predator of Arabian folklore. The ghoul's feeding habits in Victorian Gothic imagination took on additional layers of horror through the lens of period anxieties about disease, contamination, and the dangers of decomposition. Medical understanding of how disease spread was evolving, and there was growing awareness that corpses could be vectors of contagion. The ghoul, feeding on dead and rotting flesh, became not just morally repugnant, but a walking disease vector, something that carried corruption from the grave into the world of the living. This added a quasi-scientific dimension to the supernatural horror, suggesting that the ghoul's touch might spread plague, that its very presence contaminated. That contact with such a creature meant death, not just from violence, but from the diseases it carried. Women writers of the Victorian Gothic period found particular use for ghoul imagery, though often in subtle and subversive ways. The female ghoul, the Ghula of Arabian tradition, became in their hands a figure that could represent anxieties about female appetite, sexuality, and power. The woman who fed on corpses inverted every Victorian ideal of feminine purity, domesticity, and life-giving motherhood. She was appetite without restraint, sexuality without the sanctification of marriage and reproduction, power without male control. Some scholars argue that these ghoul figures allowed Victorian women writers to explore themes of female agency and desire that were otherwise forbidden in respectable literature. The influence of ghoul mythology can be traced through specific Victorian works. Even when the creature is not named explicitly, elements appear in the cemetery scenes of Charles Dickens, in the Gothic horror of Sheridan Le Fanu, in the decadent literature of the fin de siècle period. The ghoul became part of the vocabulary of Victorian horror, a recognized type that readers would understand even when the specific word was not used. The creature dwelling among graves, feeding on the dead, representing the violation of burial sanctity. These were themes that resonated so strongly with Victorian audiences that they became standard elements of Gothic fiction. The Victorian transformation of the ghoul reveals how folklore adapts to serve the psychological needs of each era. The Arabian Ghul emerged from the realities of desert survival, serving as warning and explanation for the dangers of isolation and deception in hostile environments. The Victorian Ghoul served different purposes, embodying anxieties about urban overcrowding, the commercialization of death, the vulnerability of the deceased, and the thin barrier between civilization and barbarism. Same name, same core concept of the corpse-eating grave dweller. But the meaning and emphasis shifted to reflect the fears of a culture vastly different from the one that first named these creatures in the pre-Islamic Arabian desert. Howard Phillips Lovecraft, the reclusive Providence writer whose influence on 20th century horror cannot be overstated, encountered the ghoul through his voracious reading of Arabian Nights and Gothic literature, and proceeded to transform it into something uniquely his own. In Lovecraft's cosmology, where humanity occupies an insignificant position in a universe populated by ancient alien gods and species that predate human civilization by eons, the ghoul underwent a radical reimagining. It ceased to be a supernatural shapeshifter of Arabian folklore or a Gothic symbol of Victorian death anxiety, and became instead a biological species, an underground dwelling race of creatures that had evolved or devolved from human stock into something adapted for life in the lightless tunnels beneath the world's surface. Lovecraft's most significant treatment of ghouls appears in his story, The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written in 1926, though not published until after his death. In this novella, ghouls are presented as a distinct species inhabiting the dreamlands, a parallel dimension accessible through dreams. They dwell in extensive tunnel systems, communicate in a language of meeping sounds, and possess a complex society with its own hierarchies and customs. These are not solitary predators of the graveyard, but a civilization, albeit one that humans find repulsive due to their dietary habits and physical appearance. Lovecraft describes them with his characteristic attention to grotesque detail. Rubbery, textured skin, canine faces with protruding muzzles, bodies that move with disturbing ease through cramped underground passages. The transformation Lovecraft enacted was fundamentally materialist. Where traditional ghoul mythology suggested supernatural origins, beings of smokeless fire or corrupted spirits, Lovecraft's ghouls were creatures of flesh and biology, subject to physical laws even if those laws operated in the dreamlands rather than the waking world. They could be injured, killed, and they possessed physical needs that drove their behavior. This rationalization of the supernatural was characteristic of Lovecraft's approach to horror. He was an atheist and materialist who nevertheless understood the power of the unknown and the terrible. His solution was to create horrors that were natural rather than supernatural, but whose was so alien to human understanding that they retained their power to disturb. In Lovecraft's mythos, ghouls occupy an interesting ecological and social niche. They are scavengers and predators of the underground, feeding on corpses that they access through tunnel systems connecting to human graveyards. But they are not mindless monsters. They are intelligent, capable of communication with those humans willing to overcome revulsion and fear. The protagonist of Dream Quest, Randolph Carter, actually forms an alliance with the ghouls, learning their language and earning their assistance in his quest. This introduces a moral complexity absent from most ghoul mythology. These creatures are disturbing, their habits repellent by human standards, but they are not evil. They are simply following their minds, adapted to an environment and diet that humans find horrifying. The physical transformation from human to ghoul in Lovecraft's work is particularly disturbing because it suggests that the boundary between human and monster is permeable. In the Dream Quest, it is revealed that ghouls were once human, individuals who spent too much time in graveyards, who developed tastes for forbidden foods, who gradually transformed through some combination of environmental exposure and moral degradation until they became the rubbery-skinned, canine-faced creatures of the tunnels. This transformation narrative introduces body horror elements, the fear that one's own form is not fixed but could be corrupted, that descent into monstrosity is possible through incremental steps rather than sudden curse or infection. Lovecraft's reimagining had profound influence on how subsequent horror fiction would treat ghouls. The idea of ghouls as a species rather than individual monsters, as underground dwellers with complex social structures, as beings that were once human but became something else through transformation. All of these concepts entered the broader cultural understanding of what a ghoul could be. Writers and game designers who came after Lovecraft drew upon these ideas, creating ghoul variants that owed as much to his cosmic horror framework as to the original Arabian folklore. The shift from shape-shifting desert predator to underground-dwelling former human represents a complete ontological transformation. The Arabian Ghul's power lay in deception, in appearing as what you wanted to see, in exploiting psychological vulnerabilities through intelligence and disguise. Lovecraft's ghoul possesses no such abilities. It is obviously monstrous, immediately recognizable as non-human, incapable of passing in human society. Its horror derives not from deception, but from its very existence, from the implication that this could be your fate, that the human form is not sacrosanct, that spending too much time with death can transform you into something that feeds upon it. Yet certain core elements persisted through even this radical transformation. The association with graveyards and the consumption of corpses remained central. The ghoul, whether Arabian shapeshifter or Lovecraftian underground dweller, is defined by its relationship to the dead and its violation of the sanctity we try to impose upon burial. The creature represents a fundamental challenge to human attempts to separate ourselves from the food chain, to declare that our dead are sacred rather than simply meat. The ghoul, in all its incarnations, insists otherwise. Lovecraft's personal psychology also shaped his presentation of ghouls. He was a man with profound anxieties about degeneration, racial mixing, and the corruption of what he considered civilized humanity. The ghoul as degenerated human fit perfectly into these fears, representing the possibility that humans could devolve, could lose their humanity through environmental or moral corruption. This aspect of Lovecraft's ghoul mythology is deeply problematic, rooted in the racist and classist assumptions that permeated much of his worldview. Yet even as we recognize and critique these origins, the image he created proved powerful enough to transcend them, becoming part of the broader ghoul mythology that continues to evolve. The 20th and 21st centuries have witnessed an explosion of ghoul imagery across every medium of popular culture, from cinema to television, from video games to comic books, from anime to digital streaming content. The creature that began as a desert predator in pre-Islamic, Arabian, poetry, has become a global icon of horror, endlessly reinvented while retaining certain core characteristics that mark it as recognizably descended from the original Ghoul. This democratization and diversification of the Ghoul reflects both the globalization of culture and the fundamental adaptability of folklore when it taps into universal human fears about death, consumption, and the violation of the boundary between the living and the dead. In cinema, the Ghoul has appeared in countless forms, though often without the specific name. Classic horror films of the 1930s and 40s featured grave-dwelling creatures that consumed corpses, drawing upon both Arabian folklore and Victorian Gothic traditions. These early cinematic ghouls were typically presented as either supernatural beings or as humans who had descended into depravity, becoming cannibals who haunted cemeteries. The visual language of these films established conventions that persist. The ghoul emerging from earth, pale skin caked with grave dirt, elongated fingers adapted for digging, eyes that reflect light with an inhuman gleam. These images became part of the cultural vocabulary of horror. The Fallout video game series, beginning in 1997, introduced perhaps the most iconic modern reimagining of the ghoul. In this post-apocalyptic setting, ghouls are humans who were exposed to massive doses of radiation but survived through a combination of luck and the intervention of a fictional pharmaceutical. The radiation transformed them, rendering them nearly immortal, but hideously disfigured, their skin becoming leathery and peeling, their features distorted, their voices raspy. These ghouls retain their human intelligence and personality, creating a profound tragedy. They are not monsters by choice, but victims of circumstance, forced to exist in bodies that mark them as other, that cause normal humans to fear and reject them despite their retention of humanity. The Fallout ghouls represent a significant evolution in ghoul mythology because they introduce sustained empathy for the creature. Players interact with ghoul characters who have hopes, fears, memories of their lives before transformation, and complex personalities. Some are merchants, others are soldiers, some are kind, and others cruel, but all are individuals rather than generic monsters. This humanization of the ghoul creates moral complexity absent from traditional folklore. The question becomes not how to destroy the monster, but how to coexist with those who have been transformed into something that society finds disturbing. The parallel to real-world issues of discrimination, disability, and otherness is clear and intentional. Japanese manga and anime have produced their own distinctive ghoul mythology, most notably in the series Tokyo Ghoul by Sui Ishida. In this work, ghouls are a separate species that looks human, but must consume human flesh to survive. They live hidden within human society, passing as normal, while secretly hunting to satisfy their biological needs. The series explores the psychology of both ghouls trying to retain their humanity, despite their predatory, and humans trying to determine where the line between monster and person should be drawn. The protagonist himself becomes a hybrid, part human and part ghoul, forced to navigate both worlds while belonging fully to neither. Tokyo Ghoul returns the ghoul to questions of identity and disguise that were central to the original Arabian folklore. The shape-shifting Ghula, who appeared as a beautiful woman to lure travelers, finds its echo in the Tokyo Ghoul, who must maintain a human facade to survive in a society that would exterminate them if their true were revealed. But the modern version adds layers of psychological complexity, exploring what it means to maintain a false identity, to be constantly aware that discovery means death, to struggle with the gap between who you appear to be and what you truly are. These are resonant themes for contemporary audiences navigating questions of identity, authenticity, and social performance. Television horror has featured ghouls in various forms across decades of programming. From anthology series like Tales from the Crypt to modern shows like Supernatural, the ghoul appears as a recurring monster of the week, each appearance adding slight variations while maintaining core elements. The consistency across these depictions suggests that certain aspects of ghoul mythology have achieved canonical status. The association with graveyards, the consumption of the dead, the physical markers of corruption or transformation, and often some element of tragic or sympathetic backstory that complicates the simple monster narrative. Comic books and graphic novels have embraced the ghoul with particular enthusiasm. The visual medium allows for detailed depiction of the creature's grotesque physicality, while also exploring psychological depth through narrative. DC Comics, Marvel, and independent publishers have all featured ghoul characters or ghoul-inspired creatures, each bringing different interpretations. Some are straightforward monsters to be fought by heroes. Others are anti-heroes with their own moral codes. And still others are tragic figures trapped in circumstances beyond their control. The visual language of comics allows for striking imagery that can make the ghoul simultaneously repulsive and compelling. Role-playing games, both tabletop and digital, have codified the ghoul into game mechanics and statistics, creating standardized versions that players can encounter or even play as characters. Dungeons & Dragons features ghouls as undead creatures with specific abilities: paralysis through their touch, immunity to being put to sleep, and a hunger for flesh. This gamification of the ghoul reduces it to numbers and rules, but also ensures its persistence in popular culture as generations of players encounter the creature in their adventures. The ghoul becomes part of a shared gaming vocabulary, a recognized threat with known capabilities and vulnerabilities. What unites all these modern manifestations is the ghoul's fundamental adaptability. The creature can be a mindless undead monster, a tragic victim of transformation, a separate species trying to survive, a metaphor for social otherness, or a symbol of humanity's capacity for degradation. It can be set in any time period, any location, any genre framework. This flexibility ensures that the ghoul remains relevant across changing cultural contexts, while maintaining enough consistency that it remains recognizable as a distinct type of creature, rather than becoming so diffuse as to lose all meaning. We return now to where our journey began, to the Arabian world where the ghoul was first named, first feared, and first integrated into the fabric of cultural understanding. But this is not the Arabia of pre-Islamic poetry or medieval tales. This is the contemporary Middle East, a region transformed by urbanization, technological advancement, and the complex interplay between tradition and modernity. The question that confronts us is simple yet profound. Does the ghoul still live in the imagination of those whose ancestors first spoke its name? And if so, how has it evolved to remain relevant in a world of electric lights, paved highways, and satellite navigation that eliminates the possibility of being lost in the trackless desert? The answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. Ghoul belief in contemporary Arabia exists on a spectrum, from literal acceptance among rural and traditional communities to metaphorical interpretation among urban educated populations, with countless variations between these poles. In remote areas where modernization has been slower and where people still maintain intimate relationships with the desert environment, stories of ghoul encounters continue to be told not as folklore, but as lived experience. Bedouin communities, though drastically reduced in their traditional nomadic lifestyle, preserve oral traditions that include warnings about ghouls and instructions for protection that differ little from those recorded centuries ago. Contemporary Arabian cinema has begun to explore ghoul mythology with increasing sophistication, creating films that bridge traditional folklore and modern horror conventions. These productions face interesting challenges. They must respect cultural and religious sensitivities while creating genuinely frightening narratives, must make ancient desert predators relevant to audiences who live in air-conditioned cities, and must compete with the flood of Western horror content that dominates global markets. Some filmmakers have responded by setting ghoul stories in contemporary contexts, placing ancient creatures in modern environments, and exploring the collision between traditional belief and secular modernity. One particularly effective approach has been to frame ghoul encounters within the context of desert tourism and recreational activities. As wealthy Gulf residents take weekend trips into preserved wilderness areas for camping and off-road driving, they place themselves in exactly the kind of isolated desert scenarios that traditional ghoul tales warned against. Contemporary ghoul narratives exploit this irony. People who consider themselves modern and rational, armed with GPS devices and satellite phones, discovering that technology provides no protection against entities that operate according to different laws. The desert, these stories suggest, has not been tamed by modernity, merely temporarily obscured by it. Arabian literature has also seen a resurgence of interest in ghoul mythology, with writers using the creature as a lens through which to examine questions of cultural identity, the tension between tradition and progress, and the psychological impact of rapid social change. These literary ghouls often function as symbols of that which refuses to be forgotten or dismissed, representing pre-Islamic traditions that Islam incorporated rather than eliminated, or embodying aspects of Arabian culture that persist despite modernization. The ghoul becomes a metaphor for cultural memory, for the past that continues to haunt the present, regardless of how thoroughly we believe we have moved beyond it. Television programming during Ramadan, when family viewing reaches its peak, sometimes includes series that incorporate Jinn and Ghul folklore within dramatic narratives. These shows must navigate complex terrain, respecting Islamic theology, which acknowledges the existence of Jinn, while avoiding content that might be considered sacrilegious or overly superstitious. The result is often a sophisticated treatment, where ghouls appear within frameworks that acknowledge both their folkloric origins and their potential theological classifications, creating narratives that satisfy both traditional and modern sensibilities. Urban legends and social media have created new vectors for ghoul stories to spread and evolve. WhatsApp groups and Facebook pages dedicated to paranormal experiences in the Arabian Peninsula collect contemporary ghoul sightings and encounters, creating a digital folk tradition that parallels the oral traditions of previous centuries. These accounts typically involve abandoned buildings on city outskirts, deserted construction sites, or poorly lit areas of cemeteries, adapting the ghoul from its desert origins to urban and suburban environments. The creature maintains its core characteristics of deception, shapeshifting, and predation on the vulnerable, but now operates in parking garages and half-finished housing developments rather than among dunes and wadis. The preservation of ghoul folklore has become a matter of cultural heritage in some quarters. Scholars and folklorists in Arabian universities collect and study traditional ghoul tales, seeing them as important repositories of cultural knowledge and pre-Islamic Arabian world views. Museums occasionally feature exhibitions on Arabian mythology that include ghoul representations, contextualizing them within the broader framework of Jinn belief and folk traditions. This academic and institutional tension represents both preservation and transformation, as living oral tradition becomes documented cultural artifact. Religious authorities occupy an interesting position regarding ghoul belief. Islamic scholars generally acknowledge the existence of jinn as a theological certainty based on Quranic references, but the classification of ghouls specifically as a type of jinn versus a separate entity remains debated. Some religious teachers dismiss elaborate ghoul folklore as superstition that distracts from proper Islamic understanding, while others see no contradiction between accepting jinn existence and acknowledging the specific patterns of ghoul behavior described in traditional sources. This tension between religious doctrine and folk belief creates space for the ghoul to persist in ambiguous status, neither fully endorsed nor entirely dismissed. Ellie. Younger generations in Arabian countries encounter ghoul mythology through multiple channels simultaneously. They may hear traditional tales from grandparents, watch Arabic language horror content featuring ghouls, play video games with ghoul enemies, and discuss encounters shared on social media. This multimedia exposure creates a complex relationship where the ghoul is simultaneously ancient tradition, pop culture icon, and potential reality. The creature exists in multiple registers at once, which perhaps ensures its survival better than if it existed in only one cultural domain. What becomes clear is that the ghoul has not disappeared from Arabian consciousness despite modernization. It has adapted, finding new environments to haunt and new media through which to manifest. The creature that once lurked at the edges of firelight now appears in the glow of smartphone screens. The warnings once recited by poets are now shared through messaging apps, but the fundamental purpose remains unchanged. The ghoul serves as a reminder that there are aspects of reality that resist rational explanation, that the desert and the grave retain their mysteries, and that the boundary between the living and the dead, the human and the other, remains as thin and permeable as spider silk stretched across darkness. We have journeyed far together, from the pre-Islamic Arabian desert, where the ghoul first emerged in poetry and oral tradition, through the pages of the Arabian Nights, where it achieved literary immortality, across cultural boundaries into European Gothic imagination, through the lens of Lovecraftian cosmic horror, and into the multimedia landscape of contemporary global culture. Throughout this journey, one question has shadowed our steps, like the creature itself. What does the ghoul reveal about us? Why has this particular monster, born in the specific conditions of Arabian desert survival, proven so enduringly compelling across radically different cultures, time periods, and media? The answer lies not in the ghoul itself, but in what it reflects back to us about the human condition. At its core, the ghoul embodies our relationship with death and our attempts to impose order and sanctity upon the inevitable dissolution of the body. Every human culture must grapple with mortality, must create rituals and beliefs around the disposal of the dead, must construct narratives that give meaning to the end of consciousness and the decay of flesh. The ghoul violates every attempt at this construction. It treats the dead as food rather than sacred remains. It desecrates graves that represent our attempts to protect and honor those who have passed. And it reminds us that beneath all our rituals and beliefs, the body is simply organic matter that will return to the cycle of consumption whether we will it or not. This violation is precisely why the ghoul disturbs us so profoundly. It is not that we are unaware of decomposition and the biological fate of corpses. It is that we have constructed elaborate systems to shield ourselves from confronting this reality too directly. We embalm bodies, seal them in coffins, place those coffins in concrete vaults, mark graves with permanent monuments, and tell ourselves stories about eternal rest. The ghoul crashes through all these defenses, excavating what we have buried, consuming what we have tried to preserve, and forcing us to acknowledge that our attempts to separate human death from the natural cycle of predation and decay are ultimately futile gestures against the inevitable. The shapeshifting aspect of the ghoul speaks to deeper anxieties about trust, perception, and the reliability of our senses. In an uncertain world, we depend heavily on our ability to read faces, to assess intention, to distinguish friend from threat. The Ghul's mastery of human disguise undermines this fundamental survival skill. It reminds us that appearance can be utterly divorced from reality, that the face-promising rescue might belong to your destruction, that what you most desperately want to see is exactly what makes you most vulnerable to deception. This theme resonates across cultures because the fear of betrayal, of misplaced trust, of being deceived by those we thought we could rely upon, is a universal human experience. The evolution of the Ghoul across cultures reveals how folklore adapts to serve the psychological needs of each society. The Arabian Ghul emerged from the specific dangers of desert travel, embodying real threats of isolation, dehydration-induced hallucination, and the psychological warfare that extreme environments wage upon human perception. European Gothic reimagining transformed it into a symbol of Victorian anxieties about overcrowded cities, the commercialization of death, and the violation of burial grounds by resurrection men. Lovecraft's materialist transformation made it a representation of degeneration and the permeability of the boundary between human and monster. Contemporary media versions explore themes of discrimination, identity, and the ethics of survival when biological imperatives conflict with moral codes. Yet through all these transformations, certain elements remain constant. The Ghoul is always associated with death, and the dead always represents some form of violation or transgression, always embodies the idea that danger can wear a false face. These core elements prove adaptable enough to remain relevant across vastly different cultural contexts, while maintaining sufficient consistency that we recognize the creature as a distinct entity rather than a generic monster. This adaptability explains the Ghoul's survival and continued evolution over more than 1,500 years of recorded history. The Ghoul also serves as a reminder of the power of folklore to preserve knowledge across generations. The detailed descriptions of Ghoul behavior in pre-Islamic poetry were not entertainment. They were survival information encoded in memorable verse. The warnings about not trusting beautiful faces in the wilderness, about maintaining fire through the night, about the protective properties of iron. All of this was practical knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for desert travelers. Folklore functioned as distributed cultural memory, ensuring that important information survived even when formal education was limited and written records were rare. In our contemporary world, where electric lights have pushed back the darkness, where GPS has eliminated the possibility of being truly lost, where has explained much that once seemed supernatural, the Ghoul persists because it addresses fears that technology cannot eliminate. We still die, we still must grapple with mortality, we still face betrayal and deception, we still struggle to distinguish appearance from reality. The desert that birthed the Ghoul was never merely a physical location. It was a metaphor for any environment that strips away the comforts of civilization and forces confrontation with fundamental vulnerabilities. That desert exists wherever we find ourselves isolated, uncertain, and dependent on our ability to distinguish truth from lie, safety from danger, friend from predator. As we conclude this exploration, I invite you to subscribe to Echoes of the Old World if you have found value in this journey through Ghoul mythology. We will continue to explore the creatures, beliefs, and stories that have shaped human culture across the centuries, examining not just what people believed, but why those beliefs mattered, and what they reveal about the universal aspects of human experience. The Ghoul is one thread in an immense tapestry of folklore that spans the globe and reaches back to the earliest moments of human storytelling. The Ghoul endures because it is more than a monster. It is a mirror held up to our deepest fears about death, deception, and the fragility of the boundaries we construct between the sacred and the profane, the living and the dead, the human and the other. When we look into that mirror, we see not just a creature of smokeless fire or a corpse-eating predator of the graveyard, but a reflection of ourselves, of our mortality, our vulnerability, and our eternal struggle to impose meaning and order upon a universe that offers neither comfort nor certainty. The ghoul waits in the darkness beyond the firelight, patient as the desert itself, wearing whatever face we most need to see, reminding us that some truths cannot be buried deep enough to escape their resurrection.